live on Facebook. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning to those who are with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on Facebook Live. It is a real pleasure to be back with you again this morning. The Geneva Environment Network has the pleasure to welcome you today virtually for a new session of the Geneva Environment Dialogue series. Since late April, we have been regularly live, keeping you informed on the latest developments of major upcoming trends and negotiations in the area of the environment. It is also the occasion for you to meet at these events the experts that are leading these processes. For those who don't know yet our platform, we are a network of more than 100 institutions and secretariats based in Geneva that make this region one of the global hubs for environmental governance. Administrated by the United Nations Environment Programme and supported by Switzerland, we organize various networking activities, including regular multi-stakeholder roundtables and briefings on major environmental trends. As we have been working from home for various weeks and will be for a few more, we have reconnected with our usual public and some new guests through this webinar style of events. So good morning also for who is new to this platform. Today, we have invited you to join us to discuss international governance issues on climate engineering. As you know, the world is struggling limiting emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are causing global climate change. This has brought increased attention to climate engineering technologies, as these aim to counter some disruptions and heating caused by elevated greenhouse gases. However, these technologies could also cause unintended adverse impacts and have consequences on the environment. These technologies generate controversy and they bring some governance challenges. Various international bodies and forums have discussed these technologies, as we will hear from the experts that we have invited to join us today. And also, for what concerns the climate science, the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also their 1.5-degree report make reference to the anthropogenic activities that could remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, providing a review of climate engineering measures. We are convening this discussion today as a new research study prepared by a group of scientists is being released. The report launched today is edited by the International Risk Governance Center at the Ecole polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne and was commissioned by the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. To discuss this topic that will be addressed in major upcoming environmental negotiations, we have with us today to welcome you and to introduce you to the discussion, we are welcoming Bruno Pozzi, the Director of the Europe Office of the United Nations Environment Programme, and His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez, the Ambassador for the Environment of Switzerland. To present you the new report being launched today, we have with us Marie-Valentine Florin, who is the coordinator of the study that is being launched, and Marie-Valentine is the Executive Director of the International Risk Governance Center at EPFL. We have also Paul Roos, one of the authors of the study. Paul is a science advisor at the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. And Jess Reynolds is also with us, another author of the study, and Jess works at the School of Law of the University of California. We have also invited two other experts to join us this morning and provide complementary views on these technologies. We have with us Lily Fur, who is the head of the International Environmental Policy Division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Lily has not been involved in the preparation of this publication, which was only shared with her this week. Lily will speak in the name of a broader alliance of civil society organizations. When preparing this event, Lily deplored that the voices from civil society, local communities, and other right holders, such as indigenous people, are often only included at an afterthought or as a stakeholder comment, this providing an imbalanced discussion of this important topic. And finally, we have also with us Oliver Gedden from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Oliver is a lead author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report and he was recommended by the co-chair of the working group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which this group focuses on mitigation of climate change, as you know. And he also, as I just mentioned, he was strongly recommended to be involved in the discussion. Now that I have introduced everybody, I have the pleasure to turn to Bruno Pozzi and to His Excellency Ambassador Franz Perez for additional welcoming remarks and an introduction to this important discussion. Bruno, I am unmuting you.
Thanks a lot, Diana, and thanks, colleagues, and really happy to be with you this morning for this important dialogue on the governance issues on climate engineering. It is really important that we have this dialogue as we know, and Diana has said it, there's one imperative. It is to limit the rise of temperature by 1.5 degrees. And this is what the goal of all our actions is. And to do this, we know we need to reduce CO2 emissions, and this is the first most important pillar. But there are also places where we will not be able to mitigate. Changing lifestyle is a complex issue, is a difficult thing to do, and therefore there are some other technologies, climate engineering, that are being developed, some in a rather advanced stage. I mean, if you think about planting trees and afforestation, reforestation, this is a technology we master, but it needs also governance. Even that one needs governance. And then there are technologies that are being developed that are in their infancy, and they definitely need a governance framework. So having this discussion today is really important as UN system. To listen to you, to gather all the advice, because we are led as UNEP by science, we are led by normative thinking, and therefore I'm really glad that we have this dialogue, this discussion to gather information about what the governance system of climate engineering could be in the future. Keeping in mind, as I said, that the first thing is to decarbonize by changing our lifestyle, and then we will consider other type of actions because they will be needed. With this small introduction, I'll pass the word to Franz, and thanks really also to the support that we get from the Confederation, to the Geneva Environment Network, which organize such dialogues that are extremely important for our community and for the diplomatic life in Geneva and abroad. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Bruno, and let me say good morning to everybody, and good evening for those who are in different time zones. And let me first thank Jen and Diana, you for organizing that event, UNEP for providing with Jen such a marvelous tool that allows for such exchanges. And let me also thank the team around Valentin Florin from EPFL for presenting their report on international governance issues on climate engineering. As indicated by Diana already, climate change clearly is one of the biggest challenges today, threatening the well-being, prosperity, and even the survival of many. And we are clearly also not on the 1.5 degree track, the track that the international community has outlined, which would be the right track in order to prevent the most harmful impacts of climate change for all of us. Climate engineering or geoengineering or climate altering technologies and measures, whatever we use as a term, these kind of technologies have been developed or have been researched upon over the last year as a new approach to address the fundamental challenge of climate change. This term captures many different technologies, such as solar radiation management or different forms of carbon dioxide removals. What is clear that many of them involve fundamental uncertainties. We do not really know what the impacts on the environment, on the globe, on the ecosystems, on the climate, on the weather might be if these technologies would be deployed at large scales. So there are many uncertainties about risks, but also about their benefit. And most importantly, we do not know how these activities would have to be governed, if at all we would want to engage in these activities. Switzerland was very concerned and still is very concerned about this situation. We are concerned that at once someone would start to use such technologies in order to avoid very specific problems and thereby creating other problems unwanted, but taking into account that this could nevertheless happen. Several fora so far have started to address these technologies with different perspectives. The CBD has adopted a resolution, the London Dumping Convention resolution was adopted, the Montreal Protocol started to discuss it, the IPCC, but all these different fora had only a very limited, very specific focus on that. Switzerland thought what is needed is really a more comprehensive understanding of the risks, uncertainties, and possible governance needs that might be needed. And therefore, Switzerland has presented last year to UNEA, to UNEP, a draft resolution requesting UNEP to prepare an assessment of the risks, of the potentials, and of the possible governance needs of these technologies. As you know, this resolution did not pass. It was objected for several reasons. And then Switzerland thought, well, we still need that information. We'd like to have a better understanding. And that's the reason why we have asked the EPFL and FOEN to undertake an assessment that is similar, the similar questions that we would have asked UNEP to look at. This is not an assessment undertaken by UNEP, not with the same authority, but still we think it is a very interesting and stimulating assessment, and we hope that the information from that assessment will help us to guide us in our next step with regard to geoengineering. Thank you very much, and I would like to hand over now back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Franz, and also Bruno. For the presentation of this new report, International Governance Issues on Climate Engineering, I am turning to Marie-Valentine, Paul, and Jess. So Marie-Valentine, I'm also making you a presenter so that you can also share your slides. The floor is you, Marie-Valentine, and I'm unmuting you.
Thank you. And here is my presentation presentation that I will share with Paul Rouse and Jessie Reynolds. So I'd like to thank also on my side, the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment for inviting us to coordinate this study. And of course, Jen for hosting this event today. The report that we are releasing today addresses issues of international governance of climate engineering, broadly defined as the intentional intervention in the climate system to address the problems of climate change. And we suggest in this report that decision-making regarding climate engineering, that is, as was said earlier, carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification, would benefit from additional dedicated governance. And thus the report provides information and policy options. We don't make prescriptive recommendations. That is very important. First, as was reminded also, we start with the climate problem. There is a need to remove from the atmosphere by the end of this century more than 600 gigatons of CO2. This is the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree warming. This is a lot. Annually, human-made emissions are globally in the area of 40 gigatons of CO2 each year. Depending on how soon net negative emissions is achieved. But the priority number one we want to emphasize throughout this report is still remains and must remain reduced CO2 emissions at source. And of course, also emphasizing adaptation. So climate engineering is composed of two series of very distinct technologies. The first is to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and permanently store it. This would address the cause of climate change. And the second series of technique aims to cool the planet, so-called, and could reduce some symptoms and risks of climate change, but not the cause. And here we define the cause as the excessive concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. The fact is these two series of techniques are so different that they must require distinct consideration and generalization under the overarching term of climate engineering or climate altering technologies or geoengineering, which is widely used, indicates that it can be confusing. I mean, this kind of overarching term can be confusing for policymaking and to the general public. So we strongly suggest to separate discussion in the policy debate and in communication with society. We also think about suggesting revisiting the framing of climate engineering within the context of global fight against climate change. Discussion of climate engineering approaches may be and often is perceived as distracting or even diverting attention from the fundamental need to urgently reduce CO2 emissions, preserve and enhance natural sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gas emissions, capture CO2 at source, such as with industrial carbon capture and storage, and of course, adapt to climate change locally and regionally. So a revised framing would recognize that, again and again, none of the climate engineering options represent an alternative to greenhouse gas emission reduction. Second, CDR is needed to complement the reduction of emissions. But few techniques are mature. Some could have very large adverse environment and social impacts, probably mostly regionally or locally, but Paul Rice will come back to that. SRM might be needed sometime in the future to reduce temperature increase, but there are also severe possible adverse consequences that need to be taken into account. But thinking in terms of revisiting the framing would perhaps allow us to think in terms of articulating and interrelating techniques, building complementarity, collaboration, instead of opposing and fragmenting. This is one of the goals of this report. We would like to avoid continuing opposing and fragmenting. The process to elaborate this report was developed as follows. We drew some kind of introduction about the context, the interest for climate engineering, the purpose of the report. Then we asked 4 experts that are named on this slide. Paul Rouse, who has provided a review of the technologies. That will be chapter 1. Anna Maria Hubert from University of Calgary, who has made a survey and review of current international arrangements. Matthias Honegger from EISS has analyzed trade-offs between risks. And finally, Jesse Reynolds is providing governance options. Then we organized a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder workshop in April that brought together all these questions to a broader set of participants and experts. And finally, we've drawn conclusions in the form of cross-cutting themes, roadmap for conversation, and specific research questions. So the cross-cutting themes from the 4 chapters, and I had chosen to show you these 4 cross-cutting themes before the presentation of the individual chapters, is because there is a lot of uncertainty and adaptive approaches will be advisable. Again, we suggest separating CDR and SRM in policy discussions. We also acknowledge that existing international arrangements lean toward, or even in some cases, create an obligation to engage in further research and cooperation. And finally, we are strongly, the final cross-cutting theme is that both top-down, governmental, and bottom-up approach, non-governmental, will be needed. So again, complementarity for better collaboration. So I will now turn to Paul Rouse, who will tell you more about the first chapter, about the review of the technologies. So I don't know if we can give the floor to Paul.
Please.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to everybody. Before I say a few words about the chapter, can I just express my gratitude and thanks also to the Swiss Federal Office of Environment and IRGC, in particular, Mary Valentine Florin, who's done a sterling job in herding us and getting this product together. It's been engaging and fun to do this. I'm from the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I think it's important just to note the nature of our work. We have no view on the climate altering technologies in terms of whether we should or shouldn't use them, whether they're good or bad. We simply have a view that in the context and in light of the findings of the IPCC and the goals of the Paris Agreement, it is now timely to commence a discussion about governance of climate altering technologies. So we seek to catalyse that process. We don't seek to participate in it, but simply to catalyse it. So in that context, I've drafted the chapter, which you'll see when you come to read it, doesn't imply any value judgments. There's no policy prescriptive ideas in there, no normative ideas, no normative values. It's simply, or hopefully simply, a reflection of the literature and the evidence that's available currently. The first thing I'd say about the chapter, and indeed the way in which we've dealt with the entire report, is that we need to keep CDR and SRM separate. They're very much different approaches, different technologies. They have different needs and considerations, and that is important in terms of the governance and the international processes and bodies that might be involved. And I would say also within those framings of CDR and SRM, there are also challenges. If we're thinking of trees or direct air capture, carbon dioxide storage, they themselves will have very different issues that we will need to address. So I think keeping that framing, that separation is important as we talk about these issues. I'm not going to go through each of the technologies. There's 18 or 20 technologies or approaches or techniques in the report, but simply to say the structure of the report, I seek to address the principles that underline each of the approaches, how they might work in effect, describe the technological readiness of them, to what extent may they or may they not be available and ready to use if we would choose to do that, their potential to remove carbon dioxide or to store carbon dioxide permanently or to cool the planet, depending on whether that's CDR or SRM sequestration. And then a few words about the economics and the possible social responses to them. And then finally, the potential environmental consequences of any deployment of those. And we have to think of environmental consequences in balance with the consequences of not acting, of course, and particularly importantly, as others have already said, the importance of continuing to remove and seek to increase the removal of emissions. That must come first before we think about using any of these techniques. So if I could move to slide 2 now, please. Thank you very much. The key outcome, I think, of the work in this chapter is to highlight the considerable uncertainty that remains with all of these various approaches. This table that you can see before you is a table abstracted from the chapter, and it simply describes the theoretical sequestration capacity of various techniques and the potential costs. And I just want to pick one, and just to the top one for ease of reference, just to demonstrate how uncertain these issues are. Afforestation and reforestation. The literature suggests that there's a theoretical capacity to sequestrate something between 3 and 18 gigatons per annum at a cost of somewhere between 2.5 Swiss francs per ton and 180 Swiss francs per ton. So the evidence is very, very uncertain. It's also ambiguous. 180 Swiss francs per ton to some may seem reasonable, within reach, within budget. For others, it would be a pipe dream to be able to commit those sorts of funds. So those uncertainties and ambiguities are a challenge, and I think clearly downstream we need to resolve that, and we need to have greater clarity about what each of these technologies are capable of doing at what cost. But it's also an opportunity, and I think it's an important opportunity. These spaces are important. They're these spaces in terms of the ambiguity, the stretch between afforestation, deforestation, the 3 to 18 gigatons. It's a space or a location within which we can have conversations. We have plural, broad conversations. The lack of specificity at this stage doesn't push people into corners and drive decision making. It allows us to have open debate. The range allows us to open up the conversation, not close it down. And I think that's important if we're going to have a robust but inclusive governance conversation. So that's all I'm going to say about this chapter. I've been asked to say a few words also about Marianne Hubert's chapter. This is Marianne Hubert from the University of Calgary, who's unable to be with us today. Her chapter looks at the international legal and institutional arrangements that are relevant to the governance of these technologies. And it focuses particularly on the international law in international institutions and structures that are in situ, that related to the protection of the environment in particular. And it discusses general duties, the duty to prevent transboundary environmental harm, for example, looks at some of the specific key instruments that are available to do this. We've heard already of the CBD, but there are others. And it explores the international institutions that are relevant to climate altering technologies governance, bodies such as the United Nations General Assembly and so on. And then there's a discussion of the soft law principles and other instruments that are available as well. Things that might, for example, address research governance. Professor Hubert's chapter suggests that there are some general norms that apply and they are relevant, but there are significant gaps in the legal regimes that exist. And some of the instruments that have addressed these technologies explicitly are still very limited. And that's because they themselves as instruments are limited in their objectives, their scope and their mandate. The CBD has addressed using the word geoengineering, which we might want to talk about that framing, which we don't use. It has addressed that area, but it is in a one-dimensional manner. It deals with biodiversity. So there lacks a comprehensive coverage in the international regimes, and they are the term that's used in the chapter is that they're complex and messy. It's a patchwork of overlaying norms and institutional mandates. So there seems to be a need for greater cooperation at the international level to promote effective, legitimate and fair governance of these processes in the development of the legal frameworks and the governance frameworks that might address these. And the chapter concludes by saying that it's unlikely that a single treaty or body could ever deliver a comprehensive solution for these. And it certainly couldn't do that for SRM and CDR. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Jesse Reynolds, who's going to take us through the remainder of the report.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I'd like to likewise thank the IRGC and Marie Valentine for the opportunity to participate in this report and to present some of its conclusions. First, a few brief words about Chapter 3, written by Matthias Honegger of IASS Potsdam, Perspectives Climate Research in Utrecht University. It's my sense that Matthias may have had the really the most difficult chapter to take on, in that he incorporates understanding and approaches to risk, and especially trade-offs in governance. And more specifically, one should consider that climate change governance is at its heart a question of risk management. There will be risks. How can we best reduce those and distribute those in an appropriate way? In the case of SRM and CDR, risk trade-offs are central and inherent to decision-making. There are no best options, and every decision will have risks and countervailing risks on the two sides of the ledger, so to speak. And you add with this the high stakes and the high uncertainty, and the result is a very difficult challenge. And Matthias does an admirable job of laying out the risks and the risk trade-offs in three domains, if you will. First are the physical and environmental risks of CDR and SRM and climate change as well, and how those interrelate. The second domain are the risks and risk trade-offs in policy design and governance measures. And third are the risks and risk trade-offs in research funding, and decision-making regarding research. And he offers some steps that could be pursued to help overcome these trade-offs concerning, for example, anticipation, cooperation, and joint decision-making. And those help provide a basis for the next chapter, which is the one that I authored, concerning elements and steps for global governance. And the objective here was to make some recommendations for some steps that could be taken by states and perhaps intergovernmental institutions towards the global governance of SRM and CDR. And what I really tried to do in the chapter is to make explicit the thinking and the underlying bases for the recommendations. As such, the chapter works through three foundations, if you will, for moving forward with recommendations. The first foundation are the assessment criteria. What do we want governance of CDR and SRM to do? And for these, I looked to values and functions that are more or less universally agreed upon in policy making in general, and environmental and climate policy more specifically. Most of them are functional criteria, such as reducing climate change and its impacts, and lowering greenhouse gas concentrations. The second foundation for developing recommendations is what are the potential sites of international governance, that is, the institutional home where decision-making could take place. Most of these, but not all of these, are intergovernmental institutions. And as such, it obviously builds on Chapter 2, which reviews the existing international legal and policy landscape. But here, I'm more interested in what are the institutions' competences, their expertise, their functions. Does the institution function relatively more politically or relatively more scientifically, etc.? And the third foundation for in the chapter is what are the potential substantive options? And here I tried to cast a wide net of what could governance do with respect to CDR. And as such, from these, I worked toward a half dozen specific recommendations. And if we could go to the next slide for those recommendations. Before I even begin, it is important to emphasize, as Marie-Valentine did, that, of course, the first objective of climate change policy in general must be to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and eventually bring them to zero, if not negative. That's the only way to reduce climate change risks in the long run. Specifically in the case of CDR and SRM, as Marie-Valentine and Paul have already emphasized, that it's important to distinguish between CDR and SRM, as well as among the diverse CDR techniques in additional governance. And that's because these approaches clearly have distinct roles, methods, potentials, risks, governance challenges, etc. Second is to accelerate the authoritative, comprehensive, and international scientific assessment of CDR and SRM. And that's consistent with, for example, the 2016 decision by the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which called for more transdisciplinary research to understand, as it called, climate-related geoengineering. And there's been, of course, substantial work in this area, but it's important that that future work come from an authoritative international body. And the IPCC seems to be the likely site for this. It, of course, addresses CDR, to a lesser extent SRM, in its assessment reports, but it seems to me that one or two special reports on these topics are warranted. The third recommendation is to encourage the research, development, and responsible use of some CDR techniques. This is captured already in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement's obligations regarding the enhancements of sinks and reservoirs of climate change. And models indicate that substantial amounts of CDR are needed to stay within 1.5 degrees C, and almost certainly to stay within 2 degrees C. And there's a number of avenues in which such research could be encouraged. A UNFCCC Conference of Parties decision would be one such specific mechanism that has some potential to advance this. Fourth is to, for lack of a better word, the more wealthy countries, the industrialized countries, to help build capacity for evaluating CDR and SRM in those countries that lack the resources to do so. Because developing countries will experience disproportionate impacts of climate change, they must be central to international decision-making regarding CDR and SRM. Many, if not most of these countries, lack the internal capacity to evaluate and make decisions on their own. And as such, industrialized countries could have high leverage with investing forces in helping these other countries develop such capacity. Fifth, states and intergovernmental institutions could and arguably should facilitate non-state governance of CDR and SRM. And this may seem a bit contradictory for states to help facilitate non-state governance, but it seems that substantial national and international governance of CDR and especially SRM may be a long time, may require quite some time to develop. And in the meantime, I think there's a substantial capacity for non-state governance here, but states can still have a role in helping catalyze the development and the elaboration and the operationalization of non-state governance. Finally, is to explore potential further governance of solar radiation management, solar radiation modification, should I say, SRM, in particular, while remaining agnostic concerning its ultimate use. A long dialogue will be needed before countries and other relevant actors are ready to develop global governance for SRM decision-making. This should be an unrushed, stepwise, open process that needs to begin sooner rather than later. And it seems to me that the UN Environment Program is still the best forum to instigate this, given its mandate, capabilities, and reputation. I, of course, encourage you to read these chapters and others for more details on these conclusions. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions, discussion, and comments. Thank you.
Now, yes. Am I the?
Yes, please.
Okay, yes, sorry. So the last conclusion in this report just emphasizes the need for a roadmap for conversation, a broader conversation between science policy and society, and suggests a few specific themes for research. So I encourage you to look into the report to look to see what are these final recommendations and suggestions. But with that, we're very glad that you were here with us today and are willing to and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Marie-Valentine. I just also want to add that the link to the report is available on the webpage of this event, that you will receive that link if you have registered on WebEx through an email. If you're on Facebook, it will be posted on the link of the video. And also we have the link to the center and other useful links that have also been added to the page of the event. It's now my pleasure to turn to our two other guests who will give us some complementary views on climate engineering. We'll first give the floor to Lily Four. I've just put you as a presenter so you can share your presentation. Lily will speak about the key concerns and observations from the civil society. So Lily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to speak here. So I want to start by really stressing that an overarching majority of civil society globally rejects geoengineering, and I've listed here some of the key networks that have begun to work on this issue in the last couple of years. As you can see, for example, we as the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we're part of the Hands of Mother Earth coalition and alliance, an international alliance and campaign against geoengineering that has almost 200 signatories from 45 countries, mostly from the global south, and clearly opposed to all geoengineering. But also big climate networks like CAN International, with well over 1,000 members from across the globe, have published clear positions against geoengineering. For example, strongly opposing the deployment and real-world experiments of solar radiation management. There are also big networks like Friends of the Earth International, the Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance, the Climate Justice Alliance, and the Indigenous Environmental Network that have published clear positions against geoengineering and campaign on this basis. And I want to also stress that there are issues of fundamental concern to civil society, like the profound human rights impacts of geoengineering, the challenges of meaningful participation of those most affected in these decisions that concern them when the real impacts, as we've already heard, are maybe only discernible many years later and in places far away. And these fundamental concerns are routinely discarded as minor issues to deal with somewhere along the way. So I want to say a few words about on our position on geoengineering and the governance of geoengineering. This goes beyond planetary boundaries, triggering irreversible changes. The underlying drivers in our view, so the real causes of climate change, they're deeply rooted in a paradigm of endless growth, the extractive nature of our economic activities or polluting economies, in inequalities, discriminations, racism, and the suffering that goes with that. So do we need to discuss solutions beyond business as usual when it comes to addressing the climate crisis? Oh, yes, we do. We very much think we do. But we also believe that we need to agree on a couple of rules before we set out to explore these new ideas. And when we do that, we need to take into account that the overarching majority of governance papers on geoengineering address the question how to solve the governance to advance geoengineering. They're not agnostic in our view or impartial, as they often imply. In these papers, the geoengineering researchers routinely invoke the IPCC as an authority to back their findings, but at the same time, they often ignore the warning that that body has issued when it comes to the real risks and uncertainties of both CDR and SRM. They're clearly in these reports. No amount of research can ever predict the exact response of the Earth's systems that we still barely understand in their interconnectivity, in their complexity. And any proposal that some small group of gamblers, engineers, technocrats could manipulate or modify this complex system to control the outcomes moves us, in our view, deeper into the crisis we're in and threatens the fragile balance of the web of life. So there are three core demands from civil society when it comes to the governance of geoengineering that I want to present on behalf of the Hands of Mother Earth campaign. So we're asking for an international and enforceable ban on solar geoengineering and other geoengineering technologies that would intervene in barely understood complex ecosystems to achieve that planetary scale effect. This applies to both implementation, deployment, and outdoor experiments. We also demand no public support in the form of research or subsidies for any technologies that would prolong the lifespan of the fossil fuel industry, and that, in our view, includes most CDR and definitely all approaches that have CCS in them. And three, we think we need clear criteria based on concepts such as planetary boundaries, on fundamental rights, such as human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and also the SDGs to guide the research into these new approaches to address the climate crisis. The focus should clearly be on natural solutions that maintain ecosystem integrity and support local communities and indigenous peoples, their rights and their cultures. So we already know that there is a broad support for many real and available solutions that would make a real difference. To name just a few, it's the rapid managed decline of the fossil fuel system, change of food production and consumption, renewables, public transport, community-led reforestation, ecosystem restoration. But what is interesting is that the decentralized implementation at a large scale, at a planetary scale, is often immediately dismissed as naive or impossible, or early in this event, Mr. Potsi said that this change is a complex matter. Yes, it is. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it. So I want to really quickly finish with a quick reflection on the report presented here today without going into detail, because I've not been able to completely digest the over 150 pages. Reports like this are part of the governance. I think we all recognize that. So it matters who writes them, and the decision whose expertise to include and who's not greatly determines the outcome of governance deliberations. So when it comes to discussing the regulation of new and emerging technologies, this applies to geoengineering and others, governments all too often turn to those researching and developing these very technologies as their experts. I think it's an intrinsic irony, maybe you could call it a tragedy, that advocates of geoengineering point to the failure of our existing climate governance regimes and propose to unleash these technologies, suggesting that we'll somehow find a new governance regime along the way, for which we then have even higher expectations of performance. That, to me, is a puzzle. And lastly, the very idea of geoengineering implies transboundary effects. It cannot be governed locally, and certainly not by some self-appointed experts or undemocratic non-state actors. The manipulation of our home planet's life-sustaining systems, I mean our oceans, our soils, forests, farmlands, our skies, aiming for this planetary climate effect that we might never achieve. We might achieve the opposite, but that would for sure create some winners and many losers that would require not only, in our view, a consultation of a few, but free, prior, and informed consent from all of us. I want to just leave you with hinting at some of the materials and resources that civil society provides on this very important topic, and we're happy to be involved in this discussion today and stand ready to further engage on this topic with the UN, UNEP, other stakeholders, and the Swiss government. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, for bringing the concerns of civil society. This presentation, as a presentation of Marie-Valentine, Paul, and Jess, is also available on the webpage of this event. It is now my pleasure to turn to the last panelist of this event today. The climate policy expert, Oliver, is one of the lead authors contributing to the leading assessment of the state of knowledge on topics related to climate change, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessments. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you and congratulations to the report. And I just some quick reflections on it. As you all know, since the special report on 1.5 degrees, the IPCC decided not to, let's say, actively use the term geoengineering anymore, the concept, and it tries to distinguish clearly not only between SRM and CDR, but also among different options, because it seems that geoengineering has turned into quite an ambiguous term, and very often when people talk about geoengineering, they seem to talk about the most extreme intervention, which would be stratospheric aerosol injection, and it's problematic, I would say, to confuse the debate about stratospheric aerosol injection with something like afforestation, reforestation, or the use of biochar to highlight a small-scale application. The second thing is we should stop treating at least CDR as something that is far away in the future and we're not doing, and can we ever do it? In afforestation, we're doing it already at large scales. Other techniques are in development as well. Compared to the scales that you see in global mitigation scenarios, of course, that's quite small still. But I think it's not an either-or situation. It's not, can we do CDR at 600 or more gigatons during the 21st century, or should we just leave it out of the game? I would say in mitigation, nobody really asked, should we do solar? Can we ever reach the scales envisaged? And if not, maybe it's not worth even thinking about it. I think CDR techniques will become part of the climate policy portfolio, and it might differ between countries, what they are doing. And the development that we are, and that's just the same with the conventional mitigation technologies. And it depends on geography, it depends also on political preferences, it depends on energy systems that are already there and future needs. I think a third point is, if you look at the current policy-making sphere, that governments somehow, maybe without even reflecting on it, decided to use carbon dioxide removal by deciding in Paris to have an Article 4 that stipulates to reach a balance between CO2 emission sources, the greenhouse gas emission sources, and enhancing things, because we will never get the emission sources exactly to zero. So there will be some residual emissions. That will be one of the big fights, I think. What are residual emissions that are hard to abate, or maybe too costly or not too costly, might involve lifestyle changes, or just keep going. But that will resemble the mitigation debate we have right now. And on the other hand, we will always have to find balances with carbon dioxide removal. So that might be very abstract on a global level, but with emerging net zero emissions targets in countries, that debate becomes then very concrete. And you see it in the countries that were the first industrialized countries to adopt net zero targets, Sweden and the UK, that they have programs going, and even it enters the policy debate. What kind of CDR do we want to use here? So, and in Sweden, you might have companies in the pulp and paper industry who want to use bioenergy CCS because it fits their industrial installations, or the urban heat provider in Stockholm wants to use BECCS because they do utility heat with district heating based on biomass, forest residues, and they even use biochar because they can use the extra heat there. So I think we will have these national conversations on the level of CDR, on the techniques, and of course of political and societal preferences and on side effects. And this is not a minor issue. If you look at the global numbers, you could say 1/3 or at least a quarter of the total CDR numbers are just to get to net zero. So it's not a negligible quantity. A last word on SRM. I think, as Franz Perez noted, we are not on a trajectory towards 1.5 and not on towards 2.0 degrees. At some point, if we're going on like that, we might be in a situation where we at least have to seriously discuss SRM. Now, I'm not saying that we have to do it, but at least we will enter a discussion what to do about it. And I think here to distinguish is important as well, because it will not only be about solar stratospheric aerosol injection, but we see in Australia right now in the Great Barrier Reef experiments around marine cloud brightening to have local or regional cooling effects. And that might be much more important in the coming years in the governance debate, because then it's not a talk about modeling and what could happen, but what happens actually in your region if you implement smaller scale options. I'm not saying we should do it, but I think the discussion we're entering a world where we will have to seriously discuss that. And I think this report gives good recommendations and reflections on how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. We have various questions and we are running out of time. I will first turn to Franz. Is there anything at this stage that you want to add before we turn to the questions?
Thank you very much. Just a big thank you for the presentations and for the study, and also the comments from Lily and Oliver. I think this has really shown that we need a better understanding of the different technologies, and some of them are really raising tremendous concerns, as highlighted by several of the speakers. And it will be important really to take a close look at them before engaging into something that bears unreasonable risks. So I'm looking forward to hear more about this discussion, and certainly this is a topic that needs to be pursued. Thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you, Franz. Now turning to Malou for the questions. Maybe you can start. I see there is a question specifically to Switzerland, so maybe you could start with that one.
Yes, hello, good morning. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah. And so there's a specific question to Switzerland before you leave France. It's from Andrew Morton. In the context of this current and anticipated blockage on the UN route, has Switzerland and of course the other panelists considered a non-universal membership approach, starting with a small group and then growing incrementally?
Thank you very much for that question, and that is of course a very strategic question. We have explored these options already in other areas. I remember that, for example, when it came to the idea of legally binding instrument forests, but also on issues like heavy metals. At this moment, we think we need a common understanding of the challenges that we are facing. And this common understanding has to go beyond a small group of countries who already now takes a similar approach. So I think at this stage it is really important, as indicated also by the conclusions of that study, it is important to have an assessment undertaken by a very authoritative institution and that engages and develops ownerships by everybody. Because it is important to realize it's not sufficient if just those countries who are having concerns come together and develop strategies. If those countries with less concerns and perhaps with the biggest capacity to engage in such activities do not have the same understanding and ownership. So for the moment, our focus is still on a multilateral framework that includes everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Malou, I suggest you continue with the questions, so like that we can turn to the rest of the panel.
Okay, and so we have a first set of questions regarding governance to the panel. From Andrew again, given the noted wide divergence of national views and agendas on climate change in general, irrespective of the rationale, what is your view of the potential of ever getting a universal UN member state buy-in into setting up a governance framework? And then related to governance from Daniel Bodansky, I am wondering about the rationales for international governance of climate engineering. Is governance always needed or only for some climate engineering techniques? For example, is governance needed for direct air capture? If so, what would be the rationale? And again on governance from Yves Ledor, a crucial issue. It's well known that when you eat at the devil's table, you must have a very long spoon. Here, the spoon seems a bit short. First, there is no reference to the legal obligations under Aarhus Convention, including on GMO or the Escazú Agreement. Second, international trade pretends to also protect the environment when it's actually a main driver of environmental collapse. What is different in this approach? Will it not just encourage geoengineering and provide no protection, just like with trade?
We start with Franz, because you are soon to be, if you want to add something, and then we will turn to the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, I think I pick up one question. That is one from Dan Bodansky. I think at this moment, it's too early to say whether everything needs governance. I think we do not simply understand the concerns and the risks sufficiently. Our approach would be to first develop a better understanding and indicate there seems to be some indication indeed that not everything involves the same kind of risks that normally triggers governance and regulation. So it could well be that some of the technologies don't need global governance, but others certainly will. But that's the reason why we first need an assessment and a compact understanding of the issue before starting a discussion of governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franz. I'm now turning to the authors of the study. Marie-Valentine, maybe you want to start and then decide who.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I think that one of our suggestions to begin modestly with a step-by-step approach in the context of a conversation, and the word conversation means inclusive governance, a combination, complementarity of diversity of views. And I think climate engineering has been on the table since, I would say, for at least 20 years, 20, 30 years. There is a renowned interest for that. Definitely, because we see that the climate goal of the Paris Agreement will be very difficult to meet without it. That's the point. That's the starting point. At the same time, there is no single solution. There is no bullet point. There is no a silver bullet. And so the conversation with society, this conversation between science and policy is really, really important. And that should start as well as, at the same time, it's a kind of top-down governmental initiative, but the bottom-up initiative is also very, very important. There is probably promising avenues in considering the four different aspects. There is overarching principles. Okay, there are specific approaches to, for example, marine cloud brightening. Any specific approach. Then there is a need for assessment and research, okay, which can be done in certain channels with certain organizations and representatives of civil society, but also for management. So we need to decompose the governance aspect. we need to set up a process, and governance is first about a process, especially when there is a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity. There is not yet a normative desirable goal. We don't know yet, but the setting up the process is a way to together reach that goal. And finally, in the report, you'll see specific recommendations for research, taking very specific questions, such as how to avoid overshoot, the risk of overshoot if we use SRM. Very specific questions, that would need to be researched in a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary environment, that we don't have the solution yet, but it's important to set the process in motion.
Thank you, Marie-Valentine. Anything the two other authors would like to add?
If I may?
Please go.
To respond to Professor Bodansky's excellent question about the need for governance across the climate engineering techniques, that does highlight, of course, the need to differentiate the various techniques and technologies that are underlying. It's also important to emphasize that governance is, of course, much more than binding international law. Global governance can include directed and focused scientific assessment, for example. But even in the case of something like direct air capture, there are modest needs at the level within international law for additional governance. For example, to what extent could direct air capture could countries use direct air capture to reduce their reported net emissions? To what extent should that account for potential small amounts of leakage from stored carbon dioxide, for example? What are the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements? They're modest requirements, but it is something that does need to be addressed. Of course, some of the other CDR and especially SRM techniques and technologies do have greater governance requirements, and this gets to Andrew's question about what is the scope, the feasibility of agreement. I think there's a tendency to look at solar geoengineering at SRM and to say, well, it raises novel questions and it's within the climate domain where agreements have been difficult to reach, and thus agreements here will necessarily be difficult. I'm not so sure about that. It's not that agreement in climate change in general is difficult. The world agreed on a 1.5 and 2 degree goals within the Paris Agreement. The problem with emissions cuts is the collective action problem, that is in every country's interest to free ride on the efforts of others. And so they'll commit to general collective goals and fail to live up to their fair share. SRM, solar, even the use of SRM, which may be the most difficult, doesn't have that problem, and there's a greater scope for compromise and less of a collective action problem. So I don't see it as necessarily a prohibitive issue. And finally, it must be weighed up against the governance challenges of living in a world with 3 to 4 degrees warming, which may be the choice that we're faced with, and that would surely have substantial governance challenges.
Thank you, Jess. Anything, Paul, you would like to add from your side?
Just to reinforce really the comments have been made in terms of a universal framework from the UN. It's far too early to say at this stage. I think it would be clear and fair and appropriate to say there couldn't be a universal framework that covered CDR and SRM, as we've said in the report and has been discussed. But before we get to that stage, we do need this broader, more inclusive conversation. And it needs to be very plural. And I pick up on Lily's comments. And the real challenge in many ways is how do you go about doing that? And it's been an issue in multiple other technologies. Certainly we should be turning to the experience of other technologies to learn from those. But it is a real challenge. It's part of the governance conversation. Governance isn't just rules, regulations, instruments. It's a much broader exercise. So how we do that has to be discussed in some detail. And then governance requirements for all approaches and technologies, and Dax has mentioned. When we cast governance in a broad sense, then yes, I think there probably is. DAX, for example, would require some form of monitoring, reporting, and validation if it were to be used in NDCs, that's governance. So I think we need to tease out these issues over time. So I think it's unrushed is a very useful term and phrase that Jesse used. And it's also about opening up this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I'm now turning back to Lily and to Oliver. We'll start with Lily. Any comments on the question and something you would like to add to the conversation?
I think I would just add one point that I'm worried that right now the way that this governance debate is moving, and I pointed out that in most cases it sounds very much like governments to enable geoengineering, which we would disagree with. But I'm really worried that we need to take good care that that we have some systems of governance already in place. The CBD was mentioned, and it has a de facto moratorium backed by 196 states. We have the London Protocol, we have human rights, environmental rights, we have a governance regime. And I think we need to be really careful that any further deliberations on governance do not undermine that already quite weak system of governance in place. And we need to instead, because we can't put our hopes into some future governance system that we have high expectations for, we need to first of all sort of defend and build on the stepping stones that we have. And that also means that cutting CDR out of that debate and saying that is not geoengineering risks doing just that, undermining the existing governance regime.
Thank you, Lily. Oliver, I'm turning back to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we really can talk about an existing government regime. Of course, we have these decisions. I would not call CBD decision a moratorium, or Lily says it's a de facto moratorium, so it doesn't seem to be a moratorium. It doesn't work like that. It's, all due respect, only a COP decision, and there are many of these. I think we have to look at the techniques, and we have to, and there I really like Dan's question, we have to look where do we really need international governance. And I think for CDR, for many of the terrestrial issues, we don't need it. Of course, we need MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification on an international level. But for ocean or marine CDR options, which would clearly have transboundary effects, of course, we need international governance. And I think here the London Protocol really and London Convention really is an important decision, piece of governance to be considered. I feel that policymakers don't want to rush into that debate. They fear the downsides, the risks, not only in terms of ecosystem risk, but also the political risks of even discussing that. And if you look at national governments or the European Union level, they all go for land-based CDR right now, and maybe direct air capture, because politically that seems to be the safe route for them.
Thank you, Oliver. We are late with time, so I propose that I give the final floor to Bruno to close the event. The conversation continues with the reading of the report that is now available online, and a few other elements and links that are also being made available both on the internet, on the center that edited the report, and on the webpage of this event. So I'm turning out to Bruno to some final comments. So Marie-Valentine, is there anything you would like to add? Otherwise, I will turn to Bruno to...
No, I would like to thank everyone, but nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Diana, and thanks, colleagues, for an extremely interesting debate, and the variety of questions and comments that were made after the presentations show how complex the issue is. And we started with this. I think we have clearly further debates to have and further discussions to have around this important matter of climate engineering. The call from civil society is something that all leaders have to hear, but the call from science as well, guiding us into decision making, is really what I also take out of this debate. As I said, it's a journey, and it's a journey that humanity will have to take, because at the end of the day, it's the future of our planet and our existence on this Mother Earth that we are discussing. Thanks to the GEN for having steered the debate, not only in Geneva, but also more broadly around the world, because we are online with participants from all corners of our planet. And I think as UNEP, it was really an enriching experience to hear you and to get the results of this study, but also to hear what the debate that followed, and definitely we will continue working with member states and with all stakeholders to analyze these climate engineering solutions and the governance issues that are linked to it. Thanks a lot, and have a good day on my side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you also to all the panelists. As you have just heard, the conversation continues. We invite you all to go to the webpage of this event, where you will find important links. We want to thank you for being with us this morning. To apologize for being a little bit late with time.